Hello and welcome to this very special episode of SparkYo's Untitled movie review project. I'm SparkYo, and I'm sitting here with my best friend in the world. He's a huge supporter of the show. He helps me out with all of my problems. Introducing future SparkYo. SparkYo, are you excited to be here today? Yes. And I'm excited too because of our experience with the Hollywood Insider only premiere, preview, pre-screening of Disney's Avatar 2, The Way of the Water. I brought him in for an exclusive interview. So, SparkYo, first of all, do you love Disney? Yes, and? Now that is surprising. So let's get right into it. SparkYo, are you ready to talk about this year's biggest blockbuster hit? Yes, and hashtag me too. But first, let's talk about this week's sponsored product. It's the Old Skool Classiq II HD 720p twin video game system.
This is a Classiq to the HD2 Old Skool. This is a box that, in theory, outputs your Super Nintendo and NES games in glorious HD 720p, meaning it has HDMI. So you can plug into your HD TV and bypass its terrible composite inputs, if it even has them. Also, this box has its own set of terrible composite outputs, or maybe they're not so bad. I don't know yet. I bought this from Amazon in the condition used, quote-unquote, very good, meaning somebody returned this because it was broken or it just sucked. Although it better not suck because I already know it's broken. So pulling it out of the box, I've definitely felt worse plastic cases before. That switch feels very cheap. The reset button has this annoying springy noise to it. Got the 4 inputs, and the output switch was preset to PAL. Ordinarily, I would think that would be enough for somebody who doesn't know any better to have returned this thing. Case has a little bit of flex, but it's relatively stiff. Now onto the real problem. This door is incredibly cheap, and the first time I touched it, it broke. It popped out of place, and I can't get it back in. Even worse, there's a big glob of hot glue that got left on the NES connector. And to think it says it was QC passed. Now this came pre-broken, but let's chalk that up to shipping damage because this is my first time opening this. So also in the box you have AV cables, HDMI cable, micro USB cable, USB power brick, which is 2 amps, 10 watts. An exceptionally cheap filling NES controller. Actually, the D-pad is not the worst. This also has QC pass. And an unopened Super Nintendo controller. The Super Nintendo controller is still really cheap, but a little bit better. I actually like how clicky the L and R buttons are. The start and select on the Super Nintendo controller are made out of rubber, but they're plastic on the NES controller. I'm actually kind of surprised they didn't just reuse the same part. Get to know your new best friend. Man, that's depressing. The manual is really bare bones. Make sure to observe the following. All right, let's crack this open. I count 1, 2, 3, 4 Phillips screws. Okay, we've got this ribbon cable that we're gonna have to get out of the way. Let's try to fix this door before we mess around with the circuit board. 4 more screws. There we go. Glorious. So the spring from the NES door was jammed into this spring from the Super Nintendo, and I think that was the problem? There doesn't seem to be any way to stop that from happening again, so let's hope it doesn't. This thing's kind of bent weird. Maybe we can just tuck it out of the way. Ah, great. No, whatever. Springs are annoying. Gun. It's super janky. Clearly no thought went into the design of this thing, so it's just gonna be super janky. It is what it is, and what it is sucks. Time for the main board. So we have the 4 controller ports on this cheap circuit board with a ribbon cable and glue. We have the power LED and lots of little bits of hot glue just kind of hanging out there. Oh, speaking of which, fixed. Okay, so I've pulled the board out and given it a look over, and I gotta say that the assembly of this thing makes me unhappy. Before we talk about that, let's get oriented. The main chips of note are labeled TCT975, TCT976, and TCT978. These two are from ST Micro. These two are from Cypress Semiconductor. This all would be for your Super Nintendo. The NES, I think, is a system on a chip, all underneath this blob here. And then the HDMI controller is labeled 14D MP1F505.002052. The NES section of the board is just weird. So this was all originally part of the board. You can tell by the way it was snapped out right here. Then they removed it, did something, and then soldered it back on through these jumpers right here. I think it has something to do with how they attached the one chip under this blob right here, but I'm not really sure. So I count 6 crystal oscillators on the board, which lead me to the first problems I have with this mess. My first problem is that this crystal right here is exactly 27.000 megahertz, and I believe it's for running the system when it's in PAL mode, or it's at least very close to the crystal in the PAL NES. It's very close, but it might not be very close enough. If that crystal's too far off, you might have problems with the timing of your composite output. Your TV might not be able to read it properly. The color could break, something like that. Now let's take a closer look at this little crystal oscillator right here. See, it's just kind of hanging out there, and it's literally just sitting above some surface mount components. This guy's like me in Colorado. He's all bent out of shape because he doesn't fit in. That's one of many issues I have with the assembly. I hate how basically every single one of these electrolytic capacitors have been installed. Like, look at this guy. They just sort of gave up on him. Now you see these blobs of solder down at its base. If you look at the other side, the legs are supposed to be sticking out right here so they'd be trimmed off, and they just didn't do it. You have soldering issues all over the place. The leg of this capacitor has a blob of solder on it that just isn't touching the board. The leg of this crystal oscillator is not soldered to this pad. This capacitor got soldered, but it looks like the pad's lifted off the board. That's going to be a problem to fix. The same goes for this capacitor here. It's loose because these pads are lifting off the board. More missing solder right here, but there might be enough to have a connection. Look, if I could do a better job at soldering, then you know your technician's messed up. So this is the point where I would want to plug this into the TV and show you if it's any good at playing games. But at this point, I don't think this board is going to work, and I haven't even tried turning this on yet. So I'm going to have to plug in my soldering iron and spend some time troubleshooting and fixing this thing, and that's just not going to happen tonight. So until next time, I'll see you later.
Do you think that ad was too long?
Yes. And?
Well, so let's talk about the movie. No spoilers, but was it amazing?
I didn't see it.
Me neither. Bye!
I've got a